I find it utterly unbelievable that the history of such a stunningly beautiful country as New Zealand could be tarnished back in 1921 by a gruesome and grisly incident. This incident is one of the most gruesome that I've come across in quite a while, and today I'm going to tell you the story of the Mangumahu murder. Now get ready to dive into the world of mystery, intrigue and crime. Today I'm going to tell you the story of the demise of a man called George Gordon. Now George was a chap in around his 40s and he lived in a place called Mangumahu, which is near Wanganui in New Zealand. He lived and worked on a farm owned by a guy called Cecil. Previously George had been a bushman, but at the time of this incident he was working on the roads and also doing jobs around the farm for Cecil and for other farmers in the local area. George lived in a traditional Maori rough hut known as a ware on the farm. He shared this with another chap called Merv Addenbrook, but these two were like chalk and cheese really. Merv was quiet and unassuming, whereas George Gordon was a hardened drinker. And every 6 weeks or so he would go on a complete bender. He'd have some of his friends in the accommodation with him and they would just drink and drink and drink. Within the accommodation, George had the bigger room which was to the front of the hut and Merv had the smaller room at the back. Now, when George went on his benders and was drinking with his friends, it caused no end of problems for Merv because he just could not get any sleep at night because of all the noise and the singing and the shouting that goes with drink-fueled sessions like this. George's drinking sessions usually went on for around about a week, but on this particular occasion, the time of this incident, it had been going on considerably longer, at least a fortnight this time. Merv was at his wit's end. He was getting no sleep at all, and on this particular occasion he went up to a friend of George's called Jack Kinsella. I say a friend, he was one of his drinking buddies, and tried to remonstrate with him and see if he could quieten things down. But his remonstrations fell on deaf ears, and in fact Jack Kinsella offered to bash his brains out. That was not something that Merv particularly desired. Now, on the morning of the 22nd of July 1921, Merv was going off to work in the morning. He too worked on the farm for Cecil. As he left the accommodation, he saw George Gordon out front and he was there sharpening his axe. Now, several things led Merv to believe that something bad was going to happen this day. Not only the fact that George Gordon and his mates had been drinking heavily for the past 2 weeks, we now had George messing around with an axe, and there'd been another incident as well. Jack Kinsella had taken a long sharp knife that belonged to Merv and he'd drawn it across George Gordon's throat. When he did this, George turned round to him and said, "You made a bloody bad job of that, Jack." So Merv went off to work and he did his work during the day. And he'd also spoken to Cecil about his lack of sleep. And Cecil had said, "You can come to my house for dinner and you can also stay there to see if you can get some sleep. But you'll have to go back to the ware and get your bedclothes before you come." Now, there had been a lot of drinking going on the previous night. I think Jack Kinsella, George Gordon and another guy had gotten through about 2 bottles of whiskey between them. And during this day, whilst Merv was at work, Jack Kinsella had gone to the local Mangumahu hotel, which sold liquor, and had restocked them for that coming evening. Now, on returning from work, Merv went to the ware. He needed to get washed and brushed up because he was going to have dinner at Cecil's, and he also had to get some bedclothes so he could spend the night there and try to get some much needed sleep. But as he walked into the ware, he knew immediately something was amiss. He found himself walking through some sort of sticky, horrible liquid that seemed to be all over the floor in the big room. It was very dark, so he couldn't initially see what it was, and so he struck a match. by the light of the match, which was flickering and lighting up the room. He was horrified at what he saw. There, lying on the floor, was George Gordon, and his head had been chopped off and was lying by the side of one of his shoulders, pretty much just attached to the body still by a flap of skin from the neck. And there was blood everywhere. He was quite a fat man. He must have been bleeding profusely for quite a while. Jack Kinsella and another man were sat in the room, and they were drunk as skunks, really, really intoxicated. And they were just chatting as if nothing had gone on. There was this dead body lying on the floor with its head chopped off, but they seemed to just be having a good time and drinking even more. Kinsella was telling the other man, yes, it was me that did the deed. My old bushmate there asked me to cut his head off, and so I did. The way the story turns out was, in fact, that George, who was prone to making these stupid requests, had actually asked Jack Kinsella to chop his head off. And at this, Jack Kinsella had gone out of the ware, out to the shed outside, retrieved an axe, and when he went in and George lay on the floor, that's exactly what he did. He chopped his head off. Merv ran out of the ware and ran back to Cecil's place. He told him there'd been a murder, and he told him exactly what had happened. George Gordon had lost his head. Cecil asked Merv to run round to another guy's house called Jim Campbell to get some help, because Jack Kinsella would obviously need restraining if this is what he'd done. Cecil said they would need Jim's help because he feared for his family. Who knows what Jack Kinsella might do next? But when Merv got to Jim's house, Jim was fairly nonchalant about the whole thing, despite being told there's a murder, and he insisted on finishing his meal before he came. And so eventually they all returned to the ware, but they actually ran into Jack Kinsella and the other guy who were coming to Cecil's house to ask them to phone the police. Now, all of them managed to hold on to Jack Kinsella and the other guy and keep them talking just on the road at the time until some other neighbours arrived to assist. It started to rain, so they actually got them into a wool shed just to keep them there until the police arrived. It took a good 3 hours for the police to arrive, and while they were waiting, Jack Kinsella started pacing up and down and seemed very, very restless. So much though it went against the grain, really, considering he'd been drinking the whole night before and most of that day, they gave him a large tot of whiskey to try and calm him down a little bit. Eventually they could see the police car coming in the distance, but as soon as Jack Kinsella saw the lights, he made a bit of a run for it. But one of the neighbours tripped him up and they managed to grab hold of him and restrain him until the police arrived. Jack Kinsella was placed in the police car and he was taken off to the police station. But one officer stayed behind because he had to examine the scene of the murder and clean up. Now, nothing really happened until the following morning, when the policeman, whose name was McMullen, and Merv went back up to the ware to try and sort the corpse out and clean the place up a little. They cleaned up as best they could. There's a lot of dried blood on the floor, as you would expect. And then they wrapped George Gordon's body in some blankets. Now, they had to transport the body back to the Mangumahu hotel. But before they did this, McMullen crudely sewed the corpse's head back on using baling twine. By this time, Merv's cousin had arrived with a 5-seater car, and they just sat the corpse in the back of the car like he was a passenger. And so, with the corpse in the back, they did the 6-mile journey to Mangumahu. And when they arrived at the hotel, the police officer, McMullen, dragged the corpse out, dragged it over to the veranda of the hotel, and just sat it up against the wall outside. Can you imagine what a gruesome sight that would be? A dead body with its head roughly sewn back on with baling twine. Now, of course, the corpse would have to be transported from Mangumahu to Wanganui, where there were more facilities. And they had to wait for the local mail bus to arrive, and this would be its transport back to its final resting place. And so after the driver had eaten, they placed the corpse in the very back compartment of the bus. There were no other passengers at the time, so the only guy on the bus was the driver and the constable and the corpse of George Gordon. Now, when they were about halfway back to Wanganui, the bus actually stopped to pick up some Maori passengers, and one of the guys had a bag with him, and he said, "Where can I put my bag?" And the driver directed him to the back of the bus. The constable told him, "Just open that door at the back and pop your bag in there." But when he did so, he opened the door and saw the corpse of George Gordon. It was wrapped in blankets, but one of his feet was protruding out. Now, this was too much for the Maori, and he thought, forget the bus, and he just ran. Now, after a few days, an inquest was held, and Merv Addenbrooke would be one of the chief witnesses. And Merv was questioned about why he had such a premonition earlier in the day that something bad was about to happen. And the only honest answer he could give was that he knew George, and asking someone to cut off his head was just the kind of stupid thing that George would do when drunk. In fact, on several occasions, when Merv had been cleaning his rifle, he'd asked Merv to shoot him. So Merv was in no doubt. If Jack Kinsella said that George asked him to cut his head off, then he probably did. But just because he asked him to do it, does that mean it's not murder? Well, I'm afraid in law it was murder, because despite the fact that George had asked him to cut off his head, the final responsibility for either doing or not doing that act lay with Jack Kinsella, and he admitted to chopping off George's head, so therefore it was murder. At the subsequent trial, Merv again gave evidence, and Jack Kinsella was convicted of murder and sentenced to 14 years in prison. He eventually wound up serving 8 years of that sentence, and he was released for good behaviour after 8 years. Now, was that long enough a time to serve for chopping someone's head off and killing them? I'll leave you to be the judge of that. All we can say is that this incident was exacerbated by the extreme amount of alcohol that had been consumed. And in fact, the brand Sandy McDonald whiskey, which is what they'd been drinking the night before and during the day of George's death, was taken off of the market in New Zealand and remained unavailable for 66 years. And so that's the end of the sad tale of the demise of George Gordon. And one can only speculate what kind of effect it had on young Merv Addenbrooke for the rest of his life, having witnessed what had gone on, especially walking into that room where the floor was covered in sticky, horrible blood. And with that picture in your mind, and on that note, I'll ask you to stay curious and stay safe. And thank you for watching. Are you fascinated by true crime mysteries and the weird and wonderful? I know I am. So if you are too, you're in the right place. So if you like what you see, please let me know so I can see what you like. And if you don't want to miss out on future videos, you might want to consider subscribing and turning on notifications.